Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing some of the most pressing issues facing our world today. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I'm normally joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm from Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. But today, Michael is experiencing some flight complications, so he has recorded a video for us to help us frame our conversation for today. We'll go ahead and show that video now before I introduce our guest for today's program.
This climate crisis that we're in has been recently called the existential crisis of our time by President Joe Biden. Many others before him have also defined it as such. We've seen it on full display through the unprecedented storms and hurricanes and floods and wildfires that we've had to helplessly endure. Communities that are impacted by environmental injustice see it daily. They see it in the smog-filled air when they exit the comfort of their often subpar dwellings. They see it as they stare at the piles of contaminated soil that sit uncovered across from their schools. This crisis affects us all. It is a call for us all to get involved because there is a need for us all to be involved. We need an intergenerational response. Well, I'm glad to say on Sunday, there will be thousands of people coming together to answer the call. We will be lining the streets in collective solidarity to call on the rest of society to answer this call. Now, I'm on my way to get things started for y'all. I'm getting the party started, if you will. However, I know without a shadow of a doubt that you're in good hands. I look forward to hearing from and seeing you soon. Today, as always, I offer to you love, peace, and light.
All right, good to have Michael start us off. I'll now introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll be speaking. Jim Antal serves as Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. Antal's book, Climate Church, Climate World, just released in a revised and updated second edition, is being read by hundreds of churches. From 2006 to 2018, Antal led 350 UCC churches in Massachusetts as their conference minister and president. He has preached on climate change since 1988 in over 400 settings and has engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience on numerous occasions. Up next, we'll have Gabriela Martinez, who grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, to a Peruvian Catholic household where she developed a passionate voice for the rights of migrant and poor communities while also working to ensure democracy and voting. During her time as a university student, she was active in biological research in the New England area. She graduated from Xavier University with a degree in science and peace and justice studies, where she was during that time was introduced to active Jesuits and Franciscans through the community that gathered at Bellarmine Chapel. Finally, we'll have Ali Tharp, who is a senior organizer on the U.S. regional team of Green Faith, a global grassroots climate justice organization. She is a lay community minister in the Unitarian Universalist tradition and has been organizing with a variety of faith communities and campaigns for climate justice and an end to the fossil fuel era since 2012. Ali lives in Austin, Texas, where she loves to garden, cook, play soccer, and volunteer her time as a core leader of the Festival Beach Food Forest, a community-managed edible and medicinal forest garden on public park land. She additionally serves as a board member of the Serafina Food Pantry. We're excited to have all our panelists with us today. Jim, if you could get us started.
Thanks very much, Brooks. And it's great to be with you, Gabrielle and Ali, and with everybody else who's on this call. Much of what I have to say will focus on Greta Thunberg and the movement that she inspired. But the climate movement in the United States begins in the summer of 2006, when a small group of students from Middlebury College joined their professor, Bill McKibben, on a 5-day walk across Vermont to call for action on global warming. The next year, in both April and November, those same students organized and inspired hundreds of actions across the country, demanding that our government act on climate. In March 2008, this movement took the name of 350.org. It began organizing chapters of mostly college-age people throughout the world. Then, in October 2009, a month before the United Nations climate talks in Copenhagen, 350.org coordinated more than 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. Foreign Policy magazine called it the largest ever global coordinated rally of any kind. But the utter failure of the UN climate talks in 2009 showed the world that we needed a climate movement. And 350.org had already made it clear that youth would provide leadership. In 2011, 350, together with indigenous leaders, the Sierra Club and others, began focusing on the supply side of the climate crisis. In August 2011, 1,253 protesters were arrested at the White House to stop the KXL pipeline. Bill McKibben launched the divestment movement in August 2012, which was another supply-side approach. 11 years after that divestment movement was launched, portfolios currently worth over $40 trillion have purged their portfolios of fossil fuel stocks. Back to 2011, and it was about that time that 8-year-old Greta Thunberg first learned about the climate crisis. Looking back, she reports, "I began thinking about it all the time, and I became very sad." Over the next few years, she fell into a deep depression. She talked to very few people beyond her family, and for the most part, she stopped eating, and as a consequence of that, she stopped growing. Thank God her parents listened to her and supported her. And thank God, during this dark time, Greta saw that she was not alone. In 2014, over 400,000 showed up for the People's Climate March in New York City. In November 2015, the day before the opening of the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris, a global climate march was organized involving almost 800,000 people in more than 2,000 events and 175 different countries. And on the first day of the Paris Climate Conference, a climate strike was organized involving over 500,000 students in over 100 countries. When school started in August 2018, Greta decided she had to do something. So 15-year-old Greta sat outside the Swedish parliament with a simple hand-painted sign that read, "School Strike for Climate." No one joined her on that rainy day. And when she returned a few days later, several people did join her. This confirmed her conviction that when she invited others to join her, the Fridays for the Future movement would begin. By November 2018, more than 17,000 students in 24 countries had taken part in a school climate strike. That same month, TEDx in Stockholm invited Greta to address their audience. As a 15-year-old doing a TEDx talk, she told them that she found it incomprehensible that grown-ups had allowed climate change to happen. She couldn't understand why it didn't dominate every newscast. She shared how learning about the climate crisis had impacted her from the time she was an 8-year-old. From her study of the science, it was clear that everything had to change. She concluded by recognizing that people need hope and affirmed that once we start to act, hope is everywhere. In December 2018, Greta addressed the United Nations climate talks in Poland. In January 2019, 16-year-old Greta Thunberg spoke to the richest people in the world when they gathered in Davos, Switzerland. Because she refuses to fly, she took a 32-hour train ride from her home in Sweden. And then, when she got there, she turned down a swanky hotel and instead she slept in a tent outside in the freezing sub-zero cold. Her message was both unqualified and unnerving. Here's part of what she said. We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your problem, the bigger your responsibility. I don't want your hope. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act as if you were in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house were on fire, because it is. In March 2019, Greta and the other young leaders of Friday for Future called a global climate strike. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million strikers from 125 countries gathered in 2,200 strikes. A month later, she told the British Parliament, "We children are doing this because we want our hopes and our dreams back." In September 2019, she took a sailboat to America where she addressed the House Ways and Means Committee, arguably the most powerful people in America. Here's a brief portion of what 16-year-old Greta Thunberg said when she gave her "I Have a Dream" speech. I have a dream that people in power, as well as the media, start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. In fact, I have many dreams, but this is the year 2019. This is not the time or place for dreams. This is time to wake up. This is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced, and we need to act accordingly. A week later, Greta told the leaders of the world at the UN General Assembly, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions?" But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this right here and right now. This is where we draw the line. The world is waking up and change is coming, whether you like it or not. That same month, over 4 million people in 185 countries participated in over 6,000 strikes. Inspired by youth strikers, trade unions representing hundreds of millions of people around the world mobilized in support. Employees left their workplaces, doctors and nurses marched, and websites shut down for the day. From Jakarta to New York, from Karachi to Amman, from Berlin to Kampala, from Istanbul to Quebec, from Guadalajara to Asuncion. In big cities and small villages, millions of people joined hands and raised their voices in defense of the climate. While it was Greta's unrelenting focus and undiluted truthfulness that inspired millions, Greta was not alone. Thousands of young people have stepped forward to address the climate emergency with unfiltered candor and unbound courage. Their audacious vision, their uncompromising commitment, and their brilliant strategic messaging on social media, all of these qualities have earned the respect and renewed the hope of millions of people worldwide.
Thank you, Jim, so much for setting the stage for us and telling the story that we need to hear and be reminded of. Gabriella, we turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Jim and Brooks. I think I'm gonna step off of where Jim was explaining a lot of Greta Thunberg's climate anxiety and climate trauma that she's experienced. I think that many young people in this time, in this age, have experienced that. As a kid growing up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, I remember a summer where the heat got up to 108 degrees one week for an entire week, and the trees started to lose their leaves. And I asked my mom, why are the leaves falling? It's summer. Why are they? She said it's so hot that they can't keep them anymore. And it almost looked apocalyptic. I, at that time, was around 10 years old, and I thought that would be the only time. Hopefully, this can't happen again. Unfortunately, we moved to Ohio, and this didn't end there. We couldn't afford to live in the city, so we had to commute every morning to go to school. On my commute to school, we passed chemical plant after chemical plant, and every morning it was foggy. We couldn't see the car in front of us. I asked my mom again, why is it so foggy? Oh, honey, it's not fog. It's chemical pollution, which I could connect the dots through the rotten egg smell, driving to school every morning for 2 years. Additionally, fracking came to our community. There was a huge community uproar about, should we allow this here? Should permitting fracking be allowed here? Should it not? Is it good for the economy? Me and my classmates were just terrified of the smell that would happen. DuPont had just recently been closed in the 6th grade near our town, and we couldn't allow this threat to be near our homes again. And I think that many of the activists we see rising up globally, including Ridhima Pandey from India, have experienced this. She's a very young person, and when she was 13, she experienced mass flooding, and in 2017 sued the country of India for their inactivity on climate issues. And I think we see that a lot for people who have the time and the energy and, the not burning out feeling. They have begun to sue governments as a form of nonviolent direct action that is very efficient, that solves this problem. We have recently celebrated the win in Montana with the Held versus Montana case, to the change in their constitution. But globally, we see a lot more youth activists in children as young as 5 years old rising up to hold their governments accountable. Even in Portugal, there are 6 young people ranging from 5 to 23 years old who are suing the European Union's 33 countries, with some exclusions, for their right to a clean climate and their right to live. Their case is being held in 10 days, and there's so many more. There's a federal case, Youth versus Government, that's being looked at and has been, in the works for about 8 years now. I think as young people, there's a lot of frustration, and there's a frustration on the acknowledgement of a climate crisis, but the lack of action. So we go to our universities, we go to our schools, we go to our local governments, and we ask them, why aren't you doing anything? And for folks who don't have the time to, maybe sue your government officials, we uptake advocacy. We do mass nonviolent action, and advocacy works. Going into your congressperson or local offices and building relationships with people and really opening up that dialogue about your stories with climate and the youth stories with climate it touches a part of the humanity that is common in all of us. And I think that as people of faith in general, many faith leaders in the global sphere have stepped up and recognized climate change as a critical issue for at least the next 10 to 20 years, or hopefully until it's solved. And this motivates us to act. And part of that action is happening this Sunday, as you all have mentioned. And we're mobilizing in New York to ask the UN for their Climate Action Summit to do better, frankly. And I'll let Allie explain what is going on there.
Thanks, Gabriella. So good to be with you all. I'm calling in from New York City right now in preparation for the March to End Fossil Fuels taking place there this Sunday. And I do want to mention, because not everyone is close enough to come to New York, the global context, and then I'll go back to New York. So the United Nations, most of the climate work is happening through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of Parties, or COP meetings, happening November, December of every year. And this year there's frankly a crisis of faith in the process. The head of the process is himself a CEO of an oil company. And what we're seeing happen is the UN Secretary General leading the charge on trying to keep the UN a place, pushing for real climate action. So UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez has called a climate ambition summit that's happening next Wednesday in New York City during the UN General Assembly. And he's made really bold statements saying that the ticket to entry is a commitment to stop approving new fossil fuel projects, and that it's moral and economic madness to continue investing in fossil fuels. And this is a real milestone at the United Nations, because the words fossil fuels aren't even in the Paris Agreement. It's been the elephant in the room for a really long time. So I think as a movement, we're really grateful that he, as the Secretary General, is kind of unveiling the, kind of weak point of the Paris Agreement, of the whole UN process, and pushing world leaders to do more. And I would say there's not, a ton of faith in that process either. I'm hearing mixed messages around that, but that's where social movements come in to push. If we're not there pushing our world leaders to do more, then the voices and the interests of the most wealthy and powerful corporations in the world will win out the political process. So it's really important for people of faith, people of all identities, to take what power we have to push for systemic change, because we know it's not happening on the scale and timeline required to avert a lot of unnecessary devastation and death. So that's why, here as people of faith, we're involved in this movement. And I'll say I'm 33, and seeing Greta and the Fridays for Future movement and that really taking off, it feels really full circle to be back here in New York, because I joined the faith climate work during the first People's Climate March in New York. And then I was here in 2019 when Greta sailed across the Atlantic and spoke at the big march to end, the big climate march here in 2019. And I cried. I at that time felt so, I'm not that old, but seeing this younger generation of activists come in and have such impact culturally on such a global scale gave me stamina to keep going. So I'm really appreciating at this point in my life the intergenerational nature of the work we're doing, seeing Jim mentioned Bill McKibben, and he's still going with Third Act, and bringing these different generations together to push for change is so required. And it's where I'm finding hope. So I'm so grateful. Looking at New York City, Fridays for Future here in New York has been just incredible to work with, and so effective. Just trying to keep up with the youth organizers has been a challenge. They are likely to have 4,000 or more high schoolers and college-aged youth coming from different places, and it's been really inspiring. So I'll share that the Fridays for Future movement is behind So here we have a global mobilization happening to end fossil fuels. I put a link in the chat, fightfossilfuels.net, and this shows you the Friday actions happening around the world. And also a lot of actions are happening on Sunday, including the big March to End Fossil Fuels in New York. And we're not pushing actions on Saturday because that's the first day of Rosh Hashanah, a high holy day in the Jewish tradition and like the beginning of the world on the Jewish calendar. So we want to respect that. And so most of the actions, it's still not a great time for Jewish communities to show up, and we honor and respect and celebrate their holy day and observance. And we kind of landed on this as a compromise there. But wherever you are, there might be an action near you. So check out the map, see if there's something you can do where you live. And then we also at Green Faith are hosting an action hour online on Monday, the 18th at 2:00 Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. And we're hosting that with the Fridays for Future US team as a way that we can, from our homes, from wherever you live, get together online, take action together. So if you're available, please join us. And even if you can't be there that hour, if you sign up, it'll still plug you in and we'll follow up with the actions that you can take. And we'll just try to bring as many people into this moment, this pressure point leading into the Climate Ambition Summit on Wednesday next week. So please go ahead and sign up there if you can. And then I'll shift gears to New York City. If you can come to New York, so here is the website for the Faith Hub. We would love for you to march with the Faith Hub. We have an invocation of spirit at 11 a.m. at 53rd and Broadway. So bringing people of all traditions together to invite the spirit of the divine in all of our traditions, the spirits of our ancestors, of life itself, to come and march with us and give us the courage, the love, and the strength we need to make the difference we need in this moment. So that'll be a really powerful ceremony. Even if you're not there, if you wanted to just ground in prayer with us at 11 a.m. Eastern, that I'll just go ahead and make that invitation right now. Let's kind of build that invocation and prayer together. And then we'll be lining up at noon Eastern and marching together just around 1:00, right after the Muslim midday prayer. So I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat, and it's Ally, ALY, @greenfaith.org. Please reach out if you have any questions about what's going on in New York or how to stay involved. And the last thing I'll say is that this is all a global movement to stop the era of fossil fuels. And another way you could take action right now is to sign a multi-faith letter calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So that's the last invitation I'll share. It's a link there in the chat for those joining us live, and hopefully in the notes for people watching the recording or catching by email. And this treaty has countries who have signed on. The state of California has signed on. And as people of faith, we're trying to join that global momentum and push for this common goal of phasing out fossil fuels, stopping new production. So that's the moment we're in. I'm so grateful that the youth have kind of catalyzed and kept us going. And I know social movements globally were really dampened by the pandemic. So to be in this moment now is also a moment where we're trying to build back social power and make sure we can build a better world that's more resilient and more prepared for challenges in the future. So thank you, and glad to be in it with you.
Terrific. Thanks to each of our panelists today for those terrific comments. We've got some questions that are coming in from the audience. We have a prophetic voice in Michael Mulberry, who says, should we begin disrupting our own national church's efforts on climate when they do not focus on action and advocacy? And how do we begin to do that? Any thoughts or responses there?
Well, I'll just affirm most anything Mike Mulberry will say. And speaking more specifically to his point, if the various religious leaders in America, the folks who are heads of communion, if they were to lock arms and unite on this issue, I think everything would change. I think religion has the power to do that. However, having for part of my own career been fairly close to that group, you really realize what a stretch it would be for them to do that. But my God, in 2,000 years of Christian history and longer than that for some other religious perspectives, the reality is religion has never been more in need to witness than it is right now. We haven't mentioned it yet, but I'm sure Gabriella is also aware that Pope Francis has announced that within a couple of weeks, he's going to provide, and you might say it better than me, Gabriella, an update on Laudato Si. And what he has said since the publication of Laudato Si 5 or 6 years ago has become more and more and more intense and direct. So I expect what he will release will really be a powerful statement from, the world's most renowned religious leader.
Thank you, Jim. And actually, our next webinar will be focused on that update to the encyclical. So we're excited about that. Ali, with your work in a multi-faith setting with Creed and Faith, you've got a vantage point to kind of just see what's out there and who's taking action. Do you see signs of hope or signs of promise or things that you're taking particular note of and what faith communities are out there doing right now?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of action happening, a lot of different groups coming together. There's kind of two wings that I'm seeing. There's the advocacy, the government, the climate transition planning that's based in what we can do with policy and with political leaders, and from city and municipal to national, and then that international UN context. And then there's the financial component as well. And we're seeing a lot of churches divest their endowments from fossil fuels, divest even from the banks and the asset managers who are financing the new fossil fuel infrastructure. So I want to applaud all the faith traditions and even individual congregations doing that really hard work of looking at aligning our money with our values. That has been really hard work in a lot of traditions, and there have been hard moments in a lot of traditions. I'm with the Unitarian Universalist faith tradition, and it was voted down at the General Assembly last summer to divest from the banks and asset managers financing the climate crisis. So it's hard work to look at our own institutions and how we're aligning with our value. There's nuance and a lot of internal organizing that happens there. So I see that happening in many different denominations and faith traditions. And then the work of publicly being out on the street, like, in Pennsylvania, we see the Earthquaker Action Team doing incredible work, pressuring Vanguard, going to the CEO's house, going to their headquarters, just huge applause for what they do. And then Green Faith and the Jewish Youth Climate Movement have done actions at BlackRock's headquarters in New York City. So we join with other groups, the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition and the Sunrise Project and other organizations and coalitions to keep that drumbeat as well. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach, looking at our money and looking also at government and financial actors, and together using our moral voice and our resources as faith communities to try to shift those power dynamics on a systemic level.
Thanks for those responses.
And Brooks, if I could just add to what Ali has said, the Pope, about 3 years ago, maybe it was only 2 years ago, he called for sort of universal divestment from fossil fuels among Catholic institutions. This received almost no publicity in the United States because so many bishops in the United States do not support that policy. So a double thumbs up for the Pope. And to add to what Allie said, another dimension of all of this, in addition to banks and divesting from fossil fuel companies directly, is the whole insurance angle on it. And I'm glad to say that I was part of an initiative to get the insurance board of the United Church of Christ, the entity that insures roughly half of our 5,000 churches, to pay attention to this. And the head of that, who's a fabulous guy, he embraced the witness that we gave. And our insurance board is now going to be a spokes vehicle for climate action now, because nobody knows better than insurance companies how significant the shift has been over the past few years in relation to the climate crisis.
Thank you. Gabriella, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just quickly, because I want to respect other folks' questions too. Just I guess kind of piggybacking off of Jen and Allie. If you, to answer your question in the chat, if you see an action, I would really encourage you to find a community nowadays, because there's so much energy around realizing the climate crisis. There are communities even in rural areas. So find a community, and then I'd really encourage you, if you have a project in mind, to really go after it. Like, don't let anyone stop you. Like, the time is now. It's really now. And to go off of a little bit, what the Catholic Church has been doing, they have this encyclical coming out, yes, and like this little mini follow-up that's coming out on October 4th, and it is also on St. Francis's feast day. So it's in line with a lot of like the natural ideology. But it's also at a time of a synod, which is, you know, a kind of a restructure, a conversation among bishops and archbishops and all that hierarchy to say, what are our concerns for the modern era? And there's a wonderful woman by the name of Molly Burhans who started this company called Good Lands, realizing that the Catholic Church is a really large shareholder of property and real estate globally. There's a lot of folks who, when they pass away, will donate land to different religious entities. And she's working to look at what the carbon footprints of these facilities are and how the Catholic Church can change that. So I think that there is a really good energy there, but there's not been anything officially like we are divesting from it in all fronts yet. So really looking forward to that. But again, the energy is there, and it starts with all of us and acting on the things that we think are important. I love the pollinator idea, by the way.
Great, thanks. Before we dive into pollinators, just want to also kind of further this conversation a little bit as we think about mobilizing for this upcoming march and all the great things that can come from mobilizing, people making connections, people raising their consciousness. How do we then think about kind of what happens after that moment of mobilization? What does it take to build and sustain a movement moving forward that makes effective change? Is it about, you know, looking for disruptive actions? Is it about other things? What do you see as kind of the ingredients and the important things to take place as we move forward?
I don't mind starting on this one. And I answered Michael Mulberry had a follow-up, like, okay, so we talk about Laudato Si, but what's our plan for advocacy and action when we have bishops who don't listen? You know, like when people are ignoring the Pope, what do we do? So I appreciate the rigor there around like, okay, how do we align our what we say with what we do? And when we're being out of alignment and you can see it, you know, like how do you intervene? How do you put pressure? So you know, the simple question of like, do we at times need to be disruptive even within our faith institutions? I say yes. And I think it's, you know, also important to say, let's do it strategically, and let's do it with a plan, and let's do it with with a community of people. You'll be less effective if you're going rogue, and there is that, like, Greta's actions inspired other actions, but we do need to get trained and get the strength in community and in connections to actually sit down and say, okay, what is the best way to move my bishop? What is the best way to move the president or to move the board, of the insurance policy? So yes, we need to be disruptive, but let's also look at how can we get trained? How can we get the strength in relationship that we need to do this? Because it's going to take years. These campaigns take years. And when we do disruptive actions, they're more effective if they're considered within that arc, so often you start with the advocacy, and when it's not getting far enough, then you do the sit-in, and then you do, the presser. And so how can we look at, building the muscle to do disruptive action and the strategy to do it in the context of multi-year campaigns that hopefully will win, right? So that's my response to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Okay. I would really echo. I love, Allie, that you said get trained on how to act, because I think it's important to say that, especially when we're working on making this a movement that's a lot more inclusive of all identities, you want to make sure that you're trained so that if you have folks with you that are of systemically minority populations, that you aren't acting to something that might harm them more disproportionately, right? So you want to make sure that you're trained on these, especially when you're in public areas, to be considerate of all identities and all folks. But I really agree that I really agree that you need to have a plan. You need to be intentional about your movement, and then to keep it going, you have to keep following it up. It's like a baby, right? You have to keep caring for it. Or I also like using the analogy that when you run a marathon, you might fall down, you might trip, you might scrape your knee, but you got to get up and keep going. And the finish line just keeps seeming like it's farther and farther away, but the more energy you put towards it, the closer it gets. So yeah, even if you have a small action, you have to really follow up and to build that community and to strategically plan and have listening sessions to make sure that, if other folks have ideas that might be really useful, that you're listening to them. And even if they're not in your quote unquote leadership, that they feel heard and valued. Yeah, that's all I have to say on that front.
And I'll just add to what you both have said by giving a particular example about the KXL pipeline. No one in America, except for a few people in Montana and South Dakota, had ever heard of the KXL pipeline prior to 2011. But when Bill McKibben and a bunch of others of us decided to make it a focus, and we had what was at that time the largest civil disobedience at the White House in decades. That was just one step. Then, after that, every single place President Obama went throughout the United States, there was a climate action group, many of them 350.org, but Green Faith and others did this also. And they hounded President Obama on the KXL pipeline for 2 full years. Finally, Obama, before he got out of office, canceled it. And as probably anybody on this call knows, Trump then reinstated it. And then Biden, on his first day, canceled it a second time. But what it represents, the sustained action of diverse groups all over the country. Some people being comfortable with direct action, other people just holding up a sign and, waving to the car caravan going by, other people doing media work. It takes everybody to make the changes that we need to make.
Thank you for all those responses. One of the questions from our audience is a question about how we integrate into the climate justice movement diversity of concerns, namely, in this case, biodiversity. And so how might we address the biodiversity crisis as part of these mobilizations and as part of this ongoing climate justice work? Do any of you have thoughts upon that issue?
Well, I'll just throw out there, the first thing that came to my mind with this question was, what if every clergy person in America were to include comment on the fact that since 1970, roughly 50% of the living animals on our planet have been killed as a consequence of human activity. I mean, what if that came from every pulpit in the land, no matter what faith, and those audiences were asked to just pray about that and ponder that, and then maybe a couple weeks later take action on it?
Thanks. I appreciate that response, Jim. And maybe I'll use that as a way to kind of pivot for Gabriella and Allie. If you were to coach someone stepping into the pulpit this Sunday, what would you think would be an important message to convey? What would you kind of say? Hey, this is a great message for you to consider when you take the pulpit this weekend. Any thoughts, or you can tell us about a great a sermon you maybe have heard or would recommend as an example.
Well, I can just say we are at this moment, this pivotal turning point moment. So speaking to what Jim just said of like the crisis of life, like life is in crisis on our planet, and zooming out, like to show the climate crisis within the broader, like there's 12 ecosystem indicators of health on our planet, and climate is one, and the biodiversity crisis is another, and they are interlinked in really interesting ways. When I preach about this, I often talk about like, how do we move away from cultural notions of evolution being about competition to looking at the strength and evolution in symbiosis, in mutualism, and collective care for creation, and that when we can evolve our human social structures to be about mutualism with life and all of life, then we can get ahead, right? So looking at that pairing between our religious teachings and what we're seeing in the world culturally, and then what we can learn from nature, from evolution, from life itself, looking for patterns and ways to move together. So that's the thread I try to make when I'm preaching on this. And then I also want to share, I mentioned in my bio, I do this work to do food forestry, agroforestry in the middle of Austin, Texas, where I live. So a lot of it, when it comes to biodiversity, it really is changing how we live and our relationship to land in really significant ways. And joining that project, starting to do concrete, visible work, because a lot of what we're talking about today is how it takes years, how you often don't see results, how you feel disappointed and burnt out when you're fighting huge systemic issues and institutional issues. What I did to avoid burnout was find this food forest, find a place where I could concretely see things change through my efforts, and see community forming, and see biodiversity in what was once like a field of grass. So any place a congregation has land, you can be putting ecosystem services together in that place to try to, create diversity in life. So, and sometimes to sustain ourselves in this hard anti-extraction work, systemic change work, look for other ways to create the world we want to see, find that regenerative way to sustain yourself, and then create sustainable pathways for life itself. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Gabriella, anything when you were at Bellarmine Chapel? Was there, things that were motivating to you at that time, or any other
Yeah,
time? Yeah.
I think that like during my time in university at large, I guess, it's realizing that for hundreds and thousands of years of human history, religion and science coincided and complemented one another. They had this lovely relationship where we saw each other as intertwined and caring, not necessarily as stewards, but as a part of family. I think nowadays we have this kind of Cartesian point of view where there's humans and there's nature and animals are on the other side of that line. And I think telling this story, because humans learn really well in terms of stories, um, of how a loss of biodiversity, for example, or having a huge expansion of fossil fuels would harm us and harm our plant and animal families in return. I think that fostering that connection to nature and improving that connection and building on it, and that's something that we do in community, because plants do that in community, animals do that in community, is something that I would really encourage, I guess, ministers to preach about.
Thank you so much. As we are kind of continuing to work and to focus on things related to, we're talking about the United Nations, and we're also talking local. Are there things on the horizon in terms of legislatively that any of you have your eyes on, that that you see as possibilities in the policy realm of things, and are important to push for? Anything there that you would like to comment upon?
Well, for one thing, I mean, the March to End Fossil Fuels were demanding like the phase out of drilling on public lands and waters. The Inflation Reduction Act actually like locked in more leasing of drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico and sacrificed the Gulf of Mexico. And people often neglect to acknowledge that part and keep the Gulf as the sacrifice zone of our country. So I think really looking at fixing that failure of the Inflation Reduction Act to phase out drilling on public lands, which accounts for, I believe, at least 20 to 40% of our oil production in this country is coming from national, federal, public lands and waters. So that's a key thing to keep organizing and focusing on at the federal level. The farm bill is coming up. I think Thaddeus is going to talk about that. There's a lot that, food issues are 30% of climate drawdown solutions, and according to the Drawdown Project. So there's a lot there with fixing our food systems. And just generally, what can we do to get the fossil fuel industry's power hold over our democracy, fixed? Anything we can do to shift that dynamic, I'm all for, including that fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Thank you.
Well, and to get more and more and more people who are, beginning to really, it's beginning to dawn on them. We really are in a climate crisis, which happens every time there's an extreme weather event. There are millions of people who are asking that question. And these are all opportune moments to draw those people into all of the things Ali just listed.
Hey, Gabriella?
Yeah, I'd also mention the Energy Opportunities for All Act. It's really connected with drilling on public lands. It goes under the guise of expanding energy opportunity, which is just fancy words for expanding drilling projects. And unfortunately, those really tend to be on native lands and indigenous lands, especially in New Mexico. And I'd also keep your eye on the OFF Act and the Environmental Justice for All Act. And I'll let Thaddeus talk a lot more about this, but these two bills are kind of parts of the Farm Bill that really ensure access for farming and food for all people, and especially folks that have been systemically under-resourced. And part of the Farm Bill is SNAP largely, yes, but it's just how much of that is going to be SNAP, and how much are politicians going to come back or roll back their commitments towards minority farmers or rights of immigrant farmers or that kind of thing. So yes, I'll definitely shift over to Thaddeus on that bit.
Right. Thank you. I think we are indeed building up towards the end of this hour together, when we'll transition to hearing from Thaddeus Elliott from our DC office, who will be giving us updates on what's going on in the DC area legislatively, and how we can plug into those efforts. As we kind of begin to wrap up, I'd like to do just one final round robin of anything any of you would like to share to help us connect to the march, important things to remember, important ways to connect with our faith communities, any recommendations you would make for what we can do in the next week. If you can't attend the march, what's something else that each of us can do in the next week or moving forward? I'd love to get your thoughts, inspirations.
I'll offer just a first and very simple response. That if you go to church or any house of worship this weekend, you can talk about the climate crisis. And, if that sounds like Katharine Hayhoe, if you hear Katharine Hayhoe's voice when I say that, that's because she's been saying that kind of thing for decades, really.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. Allie?
My two things really is join the action hour we're hosting Monday, September 18th at 2 Eastern, and we'll take action together. You can do this from the comfort of your home, and then sign the letter of people of faith in support of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And, follow along. We'll have live streams, look at, if you're on social media, follow along with everything happening around the world, so that you don't feel alone in this, so that you can feel that inspiration and power of all of us doing this together. So the hashtags are March to End Fossil Fuels. If you look for March to End Fossil Fuels, hashtag End Fossil Fuels. For the faith movement, we have hashtag Faiths for the number 4 climate. So that's what we'll use for faith actions. And if you're taking action, please use that. So that way you can look at those and get inspired by everything happening around the world, and know that you're not alone, that we're in this together.
Thank you, Allie. Gabriella, any closing words for us?
Yeah, I guess I talk a lot in the theoretical, but I'd really encourage you to attend Thaddeus's bit on the Farm Bill, because it is really important to a lot of the food and environment structures we see in our country, and that affects producers globally. Echoing Allie, make sure that you don't feel alone, because there are a lot of people and a lot of congregations that are experiencing climate anxiety and, doing something about it. And I think you can really find a community within your church congregations, at least one other person who you can talk to and build that connection and have an outlet for your ideas and go and do stuff. And I know that if you and maybe one other person are doing something, that others will follow your lead. You're not alone, and people are likely thinking the same things that you are. And you're just the start of the action. So be an inspiration to yourself, and God bless you all.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and for your terrific insights and contributions. And thank you for your work in advancing and participating in this upcoming march. It's much appreciated.